Okay, so let's play around with the wire, and I'll show you how to do some wrapping to create some of these structures for the immersion piece. I've got this piece of wire here. If your wire gets a little bit kind of kinked or bent in ways that you don't want to have happen, you can take your fingers and just sort of use the pad of your finger to, like the soft part of your finger, to sort of straighten the wire out just by running your finger down the length of the wire. It takes a little bit of work to get kinks out of the wire, but you can see this looks pretty nice, and the curves are nice. You can make these things angular if you want to. You know, just because the material is curvilinear, its natural state of things is curvilinear, doesn't mean that it has to stay that way. The reed definitely doesn't take sharp corners very well. Wire obviously does. So if you want to add some, more dramatic elements to your piece, you can certainly add angles and do things with wire much more dramatically than you can with the reed. The reed likes to kind of stay in these long, curvilinear shapes, which are very dramatic, but you can add angles with the wire. So one way to begin is to take a piece of wire. It doesn't matter how long it is, but maybe the longer the better. And the wire has memory as we kind of bring it around. Let's say I want to bring it around and have it attach kind of like this, okay? What I'll do is I will take my flat pliers. We've got the flat-faced pliers, which are these with the blue handles. The pink handles have the round nose ends on them. So what I'll do is I'll just take the flat pliers and bend an angle in there, and that allows me to kind of hook this over the wire. It'll kind of hold itself, and then I can pretty easily force this around. Maybe it'd be easier for you to have the pliers to do this, but you can see I'm just twisting this around, and I can tighten this down onto that wire to get a really nice tight connection here. And I'll just sort of keep pushing this around. You can either do it by hand, or it is possible to grab on with your pliers and pull this around, whatever works for you. But the idea is to have a really nice, neat twist down here to hold things together. This is, what I like to do with the wire for my own aesthetic. It doesn't have to be this neat. I mean, there are some people out there. There's a woman who does a lot of wire work, and hers is very organic. And for whatever reason, I seem to gravitate a little more towards these tight bends here. But if they're real loose, an organic quality can be nice. It just depends on it depends on a lot of things, I guess. If everything has that kind of loose and organic quality, it can really lend itself to accentuate that aesthetic. I have a tendency to work a little bit tighter and less free. And so I like a nice little tight bundle like this. So that's how I wrap the wire around. And you just, if things get out of hand or get a little kinky on you, you can usually straighten them out. This curve is pretty good. I've got kind of a flat spot right here. I might just push that out using the pad of my finger, make the curve a little bit nicer. Completely up to you. So this is, the beginning of something. Maybe I bend this out over here, and that goes and attaches to something else now. So I've got a nice structural component here, and I can attach this. Maybe I'm going to attach it to, some other component here like this. And so let's do a couple of other versions of different ways to treat this material with the hot glue, since I've got the hot glue going here. I've got this joint that we just put together. Let's get rid of this. Get the camera focused correctly. This is the structure we just put together. I've cut this piece here, and we can maybe do a piece across here like that. This is the flat reed, and this provides a lot more surface area, and I'm just going to attach it on the surface like that. We could try to put it in between like this. That would be really tricky, and it would look really great. You'd have to try to match these angles up out here, and just by happenstance, I was pretty dang close in doing that and cutting that piece of material. So I could try to glue that in there. That might look really great, but I'm gonna just go on the surface like this. I think that that would be just fine too. So I'm going to put a little bead of hot glue here. And another one over here. You gotta work fairly quickly because you don't want that hot glue to cool on you and solidify before you get it onto your piece. So there we go, put a little light pressure on that, let it cool. And here, just by holding it like this, I'm not getting the hot glue on my fingers at all. So that will stabilize this structure here. Little squeeze out of the hot glue is no big deal. Again, we're looking at all of this stuff from kind of an arm's length distance, and then this is what it looks like from the back side. Okay. So that really makes that much more strong, and it strengthens things up. You can see on this piece here that I was playing with, I added these kind of as a ladder, rungs going across here. So this is really rigid, this whole structure right here. And then up here, we added the tissue paper. So we'll jump into the tissue paper next. Oh, before we do that, these little gussets here are just very small versions of this. So rather than having it be kind of an arm going across, we just cut a very small triangle and just glue it right onto that corner, and that will stiffen that up. Okay, so the next step in wrapping these things with tissue paper, or skinning them with the tissue paper, is to get yourself a bowl or some kind of container of water. And I just happen to have the bottom of a tin can here. Maybe you all have some of these laying around from the Materiality Project. The bottom of the can actually makes a really nice little dish for what we're doing here. You can see I've got a little bit of water in here, and I'm going to add some Elmer's glue to this. And what I'm looking for is about a 50-50 ratio of Elmer's glue to water. And this is kind of a big batch. You don't have to go this, make this much right off the bat. And then I neglected to add paintbrushes in your kit. I should have done that, but I didn't. So hopefully you have a paintbrush or two laying around. Watercolor brushes work just fine. This is water-based glue, so it's very easy to wash the brushes out. I'm just going to use the back end of my paintbrush here, and I'm just going to mix this up. And it takes a little bit of time because the glue is very thick to get it to kind of mix into the water and thin this all out. So we're just making a very runny glue. Okay, so you should just have a very milky mixture here. And if it's not totally mixed up, it's really not the end of the world. If I dip my brush in there, you can see I still have some chunks in there. That's not a problem. Just get it to sort of thin out a little bit. You can always add water. You can always add more glue later on if you need to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my tissue paper, and we're going to just do a little bit of bridging across here. I'm just going to take my tissue paper, and I just rip the tissue paper. I don't really cut it to fit. Some people do. Some people have really good luck cutting exact shapes. I find that to be more tedious than it's worth. But this seems to be pretty decent. I can probably just glue that right on there. But what I do, and I don't worry about this. Oops, I'm not even in the camera. Here is my piece that I just ripped. And I'm going to glue this on here. I'm not all that concerned about making it perfect. I want to have a little bit overhanging on this side. I want a little overhanging over here. Because I've got this flat reed up here, I can probably just glue straight to that surface up there. But I want this to overhang a little bit because I'm going to wrap it around the back side. So I'm just going to hold this piece of tissue paper like this. And, you know, I can trim away a little bit of excess here. But I'm going to cut little darts because this is a curved line. And tissue paper doesn't like to bend around that curved line very well. But if you cut these little darts or these little relief points, then we can make this curve, this tissue paper match that curve. I'll do the same thing over here. Doesn't really matter how precise you are with this because we're going to do a couple of layers of tissue paper. We're just getting the base skin down. So I'm going to grab my glue, and let's see if I can get this on the camera a little bit better. There we go. I'm just gonna grab my glue and I'm gonna brush on. I can lift this tissue paper up, brush on here, lay that down, press it in. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get the reed wet with the glue, and then I just use the brush to kind of lay things down. I'll flip it over and apply the glue here, apply it there, and then I also wet out the tissue paper on the back side, and then I'm going to fold this tissue paper around just using the paintbrush. I find it easier to do it with the paintbrush. So you can see how that conformed to that shape there. And again, this takes a little bit of practice, but it's not that difficult. But once this glue dries, and then I'll brush out the whole thing, get the tissue paper all nice and saturated. And what happens is, as the glue dries on that tissue paper, the tissue paper shrinks just a little bit. And it'll feel kind of loose now, but as it dries, it shrinks just ever so slightly, and then you get this nice taut skin across here. And the glue obviously will help to make the tissue paper a little more rigid. So that's one way, just a very quick way to cover that whole area. If I have a big opening that I want to try and cover, I may do this in smaller chunks. So like on something like this is a much bigger area. I probably did a section, you know, maybe this big right here with one piece of tissue paper, and then maybe another piece here, and then a third piece over here, because this is multiple pieces of tissue paper on top of one another. And adding layers of tissue paper obviously makes it a lot more rigid, so that this becomes a lot more structural. So you want to do a couple of layers of tissue paper, but you may need to let the tissue paper dry in between layers, but you don't have to. Just depends on how quickly you work. So I could take, you know, smaller pieces like this and just lay right on top of this piece here. Oops, in the camera again. There we go. Cut some relief darts here. And because that bottom piece of tissue paper is already wet, this next piece just sort of glues itself. It attaches pretty quickly. Try to get all of these air bubbles out from underneath, so you don't want air bubbles in between your layers. But the air typically just kind of works its way out. wrap these around. And I definitely recommend, as you start constructing your pieces, to not wait. Don't build the whole structure and then decide where to add your tissue paper. If you get something constructed, like a segment of the final construction, if you get that constructed, start adding tissue paper to it. Because if you start building up layers of the armature, it's very difficult sometimes to get underneath and inside of the layers of that armature. And I'll show you what I mean by this, to add tissue paper. So you may want to add tissue paper, build something, add tissue paper to it, and then add to that structure, and then add more tissue paper, and then add to that structure. So I'll give you an example of that in a second here. So there's 2 layers of tissue paper right here. Maybe a third layer would be in order. I don't know. We just have to wait and see. But sometimes it's nice to just let this dry and then see how it feels or how it looks. So there's that piece. Okay. Let me give you an example of. So on this piece, this isn't a complete piece yet. I started working on it, and let's look at this area right in here. Before I added all of this other area back here, I added the tissue paper down in here on the back side. It would be very difficult for me to add that tissue paper up inside here now, because it's just hard to get to because you have all of this other stuff in the way. So I constructed this piece, added the tissue paper to it, and then added this area on over here. So then I added the tissue paper here, and then I started adding on this area over here. So think logistically and wisely, and you have to be a little bit, have to have somewhat of a plan, but you're going to have to do your best and backtrack sometimes. But this is a fun project. It's actually one of my favorite projects that we did in the 3D design class, because the results were just fantastic. And I'll put some of those results into this video.